Good afternoon, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I guess we had a little bit of technical hitch there. The chairman of the committee, Mr. Taj Shobayo, should have welcomed us. I think he has some technical issues. So my name is BC Adeyemi. I'm chairman and president and chairman of council at the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce. It's my pleasure this afternoon to welcome you to the webinar themed the Petroleum Industry Act, a reset, setback, or status quo. I'm delighted to welcome you to this webinar. For those of you who may not know, allow me to please introduce the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce, the NBCC, which is the foremost bilateral chamber in Nigeria. The NBCC was established in 1977 to promote trade and investment between Nigeria and Britain. We are affiliated with the British Chambers of Commerce, which gives our members beneficial access to a network of 53 chambers across the UK and 71 other international affiliates. Membership of the NBCC is currently about 400 top corporate organizations from all sectors of the economy in Nigeria and Britain. May I invite those of you who are not yet members of the NBCC to do so by commencing the registration process after this webinar. Details will be circulated to you by the headquarters. The Petroleum Industry Act, otherwise known as the PIA, was signed into law on the 16th of August 2021 and established a new reality for Nigeria's oil and gas industry after over 2 decades in the making. The scale and the changes envisioned by the PIA is indeed far-reaching and profound. It introduces a complete overhaul of the administrative, regulatory, and governance architecture of the key petroleum institutions. The PIA is indeed a very detailed piece of legislation. It is in this regard that we thought it appropriate as a chamber to host this webinar to enable us examine what the PIA portends in the hope that we can educate ourselves and enlighten our members and the public. Without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce today's guest speakers who will shed more light on the PIA. First off is Mr. Bite Adeniji, Managing Director, ENR Advisory. Mr. Adigbite is a specialist energy and natural resources lawyer with expertise in policy, regulatory, and commercial issues in the energy, natural resources, and infrastructure sectors. He has advised the government of Nigeria on several reform initiatives in the energy, mineral, and infrastructure sectors, and has also advised a diverse clientele on commercial transactions and projects in these sectors. He was between 2015 and 2018 the Senior Technical Advisor, Upstream Gas Policy and Regulation to the Minister of State for Petroleum Resources. He led the preparation of the National Gas Policy, the National Petroleum Policy, the Petroleum Industry Reform Bill. He also developed the innovative Nigerian Gas Flare Commercialization Program and led the steering committee for the implementation of the program. Mr. Adewale Ajayi, Partner and Head Tax Energy and Natural Resources, KPMG Nigeria. Wale Ajayi has over 30 years experience advising multinational and national clients on Nigerian and international taxes. He has been actively involved in various technical committees on the review of Nigerian tax laws. His experience covers corporate tax advisory and compliance work for national and international companies in the oil and gas industry, transfer pricing, mergers and acquisitions, and indirect taxes. He has published various articles on topical issues in the oil and gas industry in international journals such as Tax Notes International, International Energy Law, and Taxation Review, amongst others. Yemisi Awunaga, Partner, Templars. Yemisi is a partner in the Integrated Gas and Energy and Projects Practices at Templars. She has specialist experience in oil and gas commercialization projects and energy project financing, having advised on all aspects of the entire value chain in the petroleum sector. She routinely advises on the bankability of energy projects with a focus on risk evaluation, allocation, and mitigation through contractual documentation. Yemisi combines her commercial astuteness with deep knowledge and understanding of the Nigerian petroleum sector and its underpinnings. She's recognized in the Who is Who Legal as a leading practitioner. Ademola Henry Adigun, independent oil and gas governance consultant. Ademola Adigun has been a developmental consultant for over 19 years. He was until recently team lead of the Facility for Oil Sector Transformation Project, FOSTA. This project worked extensively to support the quality and passage of the then PIB. He has facilitated capacity building exercises in several countries on oil sector reforms. In Nigeria, he has led the domiciliation of the Natural Resources Charter. He was a key member of the team that supported the delivery of the downstream reforms in Nigeria, leading to a partial deregulation of the downstream sector. He's a member of the team that produced the gas-based industry report adopted for the economic management team. Olu Vehian, Managing Director, Latima Energy. Olu is an energy expert on renewable energy and a renewable energy investor with nearly 2 decades of experience in oil and gas renewables and power sector across sub-Saharan Africa. Her past roles include partner at an early stage investment firm and deal lead at Shell, where she advised on gas commercialization and M&A transactions. Olu serves as an advisory council member of the US Millennium Challenge Corporation and an entrepreneur in residence at the Energy for Growth Hub. She's also the founder CEO of BFA Foundation, which funds skills acquisition scholarships for high achieving low income individuals to expand their career advancement opportunities in high growth sectors, including and in particular the energy sector. I'm quite certain that these experts will do justice to the subject matter of this webinar, and we shall leave this event better informed about the key imperatives of the PIA. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention, and I have the pleasure to now hand over to Olu to lead the session. Thank you, and over to you, Olu.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure, and thank you, Mrs. Adeyemi, for that kind introduction. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce Energy webinar. I'd like to thank Mrs. Adeyemi, Mrs. Adeola Aziz, and Mr. Taj Shobayo, as well as the rest of the NBCC team for organizing this session. As mentioned, the theme of our discussion today is the Petroleum Industry Act, a reset, setback, or status quo. Allow me to set the scene. Though this sector accounts for less than 10% of GDP, it contributes 90% of foreign exchange earnings and 60% of fiscal income. Until Nigeria successfully diversifies exports and grows its productive capabilities beyond the oil and gas sector, the value of our currency, the government's ability to invest in goods and services that markets cannot provide, like infrastructure, public health, education, are all dependent on what happens in this sector. Nigeria is a giant in Africa, but its share of global oil and gas reserves are modest, 2% and 3% respectively. So investors have found other options while we're waiting for this act. Our president has estimated $50 billion in lost opportunities over the last decade. Since the bill was first put forward almost 2 decades ago, the transition to a lower carbon energy system has accelerated and will lead to fundamental restructuring of the global energy system with a more diverse energy mix, more localized energy markets, and increasing levels of competition. Yet, what's relevant in our environment is that significant inequalities in energy access and the quality of that access persists. Our bill is finally enacted. The PIA is Nigeria's bold attempt at revamping the Nigerian oil and gas sector to attract billions of dollars in new investments, to expand government revenue, diversify and industrialize the economy using its natural gas resources, improve efficiency through administrative reform, and ensure judicious use of funds to deliver socioeconomic benefits to host communities. The format of our discussion is as follows: a 35-minute panel discussion on the 4 key sections of the PIA: fiscal, governance, administration, host community fund, followed by a 20-minute interactive session with the audience, and then 5 minutes of closing remarks from our panelists. I'll start with the opening remarks from our panelists. Nigeria is home to 250 or so ethnic groups, but the state is how we do things collectively. So the PIA is an expression of our collective objectives as Nigerians. We know where we are today, but where are we trying to go? Before we discuss whether or not the PIA helps us get there, I'll ask our panelists, as visionary leaders in this sector, to kindly summarize their 10-year visions for the sector and Nigeria in 2 minutes, starting with Mrs. Awonuga.
Good afternoon, Olu. Thank you very much. And good afternoon to the chairman and my co-panelist and esteemed audience. So my vision, can you hear me? Right. So my vision, looking at 10 years, I think, the starting point is that we're in the middle of an energy transition. And whether we like it or not, every country will be affected, right? It's a diverse landscape. There is no strategic blueprint that will be universal, right? And for me, the starting point as a visionary is for us to be sensitive to the times. If we're sensitive to the times as a nation, we can plot the graph, right? And in the next 10 years, because today our transition fuel is gas, there is a way in which the rising price of crude oil may affect the pragmatism we've seen, right, with gas, but we should stay focused. If we stay focused, if we begin to see gas as being more than a commodity that can generate power and electricity, but a commodity that can industrialize the nation, right, then in 10 years, we should have, a wholesale market. We should have a system where, gas has a significant play. And when we talk about industrialization, it means our roads will benefit, education will benefit, right? Security, safety will benefit because there'll be ripple effect. So one sentence, a focused leadership, understanding the benefits that gas can bring to the country.
Thank you very much for that clear picture. Biti Adeniji, you're next.
Well, thanks, Olu. First, let me thank the Chamber of Commerce for inviting me to share some thoughts with the members this morning around my ideas around the PIB. 10-year vision. Well, as we all know, I led the development of the national gas policy, national petroleum policy. So basically, in terms of vision, all the answers are in there. I would strongly advise everyone to converse themselves with those policy documents. Those policy documents acknowledge that the transition was underway, acknowledge that there's oil everywhere and there's gas discovered all along the coast of Africa, and that Nigeria is not the only game in town. So to the extent that the energy transition is now underway, Nigeria is better advised to basically take heed of the clock that's ticking. The vision is for massive industrialization on the back of the gas resources and to basically move the country away from dependence on crude oil. 10 years is short, but if you have the sector led by knowledge, by committed people, by competent people, by institutions that are well-resourced, there's a strong possibility of moving Nigeria out of harm's way. The transition basically could bring harm to Nigeria if we don't manage the sector well over the next 10 years. Definitely, after 10 years, we're moving to another era where there'll be absolute decline in demand for crude oil, which means most of our foreign exchange revenues literally will start declining. So basically, we have to be very strategic as a country, understand the moment, and make sure that we basically use the opportunity in the Petroleum Industry Bill and those policies to pivot the country towards industrialization using this same oil and gas resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bite. Mr. Adewale Ajayi.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here today. Now, when you asked me the question about the outlook for Nigeria and the industry for the next 10 years, I would say mine is that of cautious optimism. And the reason is simple. We've been here for so many years. We've been waiting for this PIA for the past 20 years. And finally, the PIA is here. And so the question then is, how do we ensure that the PIA is effectively implemented, right, to be able to get the benefits that we want to derive from it, which is to attract investment, and for us to be able to use our hydrocarbon resources to industrialize this economy. So for me, I think the key really lies with what we do with the midstream sector. People have spoken about the energy transition, right? But I know that based on what is happening in Europe today and China, that obviously, right, come 2050, we will still be dependent on fossil fuel, right? And so the question will be, how do we prepare ourselves to be able to monetize our petroleum resources by actually growing our midstream sector? And if we're able to do that, then the future is bright for this country. And I really am expectant. But for now, it's more of cautious optimism. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Henry, you're next.
Good afternoon, everybody. And thank you for inviting me. My 10-year outlook is to move away from a crude selling nation to an oil and gas nation. I think for the past 40, 50 years, we've been a crude selling nation, and that's not an oil and gas country. I understand about transition processes, and I think we can get there. But I'm also concerned that it takes time to transition because there are a lot of things tied to it beyond technology. There are issues around economic possibilities, potentials, and such. I was joking with a colleague of mine in NNPC that if we can't buy new cars that are petrol now, how do you think we can buy cars that are electric for transitioning? I mean, the economy has to grow as well. So key for me is to say, well, we move away from crude selling. We use more of the crude locally. We use more of the gas locally. We grow a midstream market. We have an effective downstream. And we increase the GDP contribution, not from just bottling and transporting crude away, but effective use of gas as a hub to transition Nigeria into industrialization. I'm also looking forward to effective implementation of the PIA. I already have my concerns right now in the way it's gone and the quality of appointments into the board. But I think one of the things we all have to do is to make noise around issues that are not going well enough. So hopefully in another 10 years, it won't be talk about crude sales and crude issues anymore. We'll talk about the economy built on oil and gas, real economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So we have an idea of where we want to go. The question is, how does the PIA help us get there? We've heard an imperfect bill is better than no bill. In what ways does this bill fall short or maintain the status quo? What are the proposed solutions to make this bill more effective as Nigeria strives to close the gap between its massive potential and its current reality? We'll start with Yemisi. One of the chosen pathways to improve governance in the sector is the restructuring of NNPC into a profit-driven NOC that may eventually be listed on the stock exchange. Are the processes and timelines of incorporating and transferring assets and liabilities achievable? How does the creation of NNPC Limited help with our stated objectives of attracting investments or even resolving upstream funding challenges? What are some of the obstacles that NNPC may need to overcome if it wants to list and access capital on the stock exchange?
Right. Wondering where to start from. There are quite a number of questions in the main question.
Wherever you feel most comfortable. You only have 3 minutes.
3 minutes, right. Okay, so focusing on your theme, question is, are we set in the right direction, asking for NNPC to be reconstituted. And I think we should all know, I guess we're all aware that there's now NNPC Limited, okay, because it's been set up, right? So NNPC Limited exists today. NNPC Limited has a board today, right? Setting up NNPC to be self-functioning and with a sustainable trajectory or path is a step in the right direction. Will it achieve that? Because there is what you have in theory and there is the practical. Do we see this happening? So in other words, if we look at the PIA today, there's some nice provisions in there, right, that ensure transparency, that ensure accountability, that ensure that there will be auditing by an independent auditor every year. You have committees that will set up comprehensive rules and procedures to ensure that committees are set up, a remuneration board, right? You have that. And also, after you've opened up the NNPC Limited, if it's no longer a wholly owned subsidiary of government, the board can then be set up by the shareholders. You have rights of a shareholder who has about 10% threshold, right, to actually requisition and demand, for an understanding, written comprehensive understanding of decisions made by the board. All nice provisions, right? We have objectives and scope within the PIA that tells us that the NNPC is not only supposed to focus on oil and gas, but also on renewable energy in the near future. Nice provisions, but we need human beings to be able to deliver these aspirations. We can all answer the question whether the board that's been constituted gives us that comfort. Does it give us that comfort? We have a board, and when you look at the composition, you see the geopolitical zone influence again. Now, you can be constituted that way and be competent. Is that a competent board? We need to answer that question, right? Now, with listing in mind, you have to, if you want to list in 3 years, like we've seen all over the news, then you have to be listing minded. You can see that in the last few weeks, we've seen announcements about NNPC's profitability. I believe it's towards that goal. Because if you want to list, right, profitability, transparency, your market cap, all those things matter. It's not NNPC Limited that will set the listing rules. We have listing rules, right, with the Nigerian Stock Exchange. And there are different boards that you can join. You can be listed on the main board, you can be on the growth board, you can be on the premium board. But to actually satisfy those requirements, the next 3 years are quite important. To be able to win the confidence of investors, to ensure that, yes, it's you're speaking to you're looking for investors, institutional investors, and also retail investors. But if in the next 3 years, we continue to see the government exert so much pressure that is not forward-looking and not positive in outlook, it would affect where we're going. So just to back up, yes, a step in the right direction, but the board and the management really matter.
Thank you very much for that. So, sorry, hello? Okay, thank you very much for that. Still on governance, Bite. On the objectives, one of the objectives is to create effective and efficient institutions with clarity of roles. The 3 main institutions within the new governance framework are the ministry, the commission, which seems to be a combination of DPR and NAPIMS, and the authority, which seems to be a combination of PPMC plus PPRA. How does this streamlined regulatory framework contribute to an attractive investment climate, e.g. cost on ease of doing business? Where does it fall short? And what are your thoughts on how we should close those gaps?
Okay, I'll be brutally frank with you. There are good parts of that design, of the regulatory, institutional design, rather, I would say. But there are many parts of it that are just downright messy. Okay, so first of all, it's good to see clarity regarding where responsibility lies as to policy making, which is with the minister, as to the regulation of the sector, which is with the 2 agencies, and then also as to where the role of government in business is, which is notionally that of NNPC Limited. So that's a good bit, but I've got to touch on the messy parts because I'm actually pretty uncomfortable about them. First of all, there's a significant governance issue with the role given to the minister without addressing a long-standing problem. If you are asked to design policy and to supervise the sector, you need to have in your office a permanent team that will help you surveil policy issues, supervise industry, and all that. The PIA misses that opportunity in spite of advice given to government from many quarters. It's a big opportunity miss. And this issue is significant because, you know how we started this session? We said there's a 10-year vision. These 10 years are very important for ensuring that Nigeria stays on course to avoid the problems that could come with the transition. If you don't have the policy, the minister given the tools that he needs to supervise and keep everyone on course, you got a problem there. So there's a design issue. That's number one. Secondly, when you look at the institutional, the regulatory framework, the two institutions, I'm not convinced that you need two agencies as opposed to one strong agency that basically has a view end to end of the chain. It's a petroleum chain, it's an energy chain, even you can say. So basically, what you've done, you've done a design that allows for asymmetry of information between the two agencies. Not only that, we also know that in Nigeria, agencies don't cooperate too well together. So that's another potential problem. So we'll find that this problem, right, would need a very, very careful management. And that takes us back to my first point. If you don't have the tools, how are you going to manage this contention that you created in statute? Third, regulatory capacity. When you create new agencies, you want to create a new culture. But what the PIB has done is moved everybody en masse from the previous desks into desks in the new agency. You don't create a new culture. Effectively, you're moving the old cultures, right, into these new agencies. And that's really important because by design of the PIA, there are many new regulatory tools, many new ideas that have now been tested before in Nigeria, new regulatory powers that the PIB vests to these agencies. And you've not created the possibility of resourcing the agency with new entry, perhaps from other parts of the public sector where there could be good experience, or even from the private sector. And Nigeria is that country that has too many knowledgeable people from all over the world, working in regulatory offices all over the world. You shut that door by this design, not good design, in my view. The other things, when you look at this, when you look at the design of the agencies, you also see that they're actually not independent. If Nigeria needs to move well over the next 10 years, you need to have insulated these agencies from the political system. We haven't done so in the design. So we have the vision is great, but we've not complemented the vision with design, good design. I could say more, there's about 15 different things I could say about it, but I think it's enough for us to go with.
No, I think that those are, a theme is emerging here. Henry, I think I'll bring you in here around this same issue around governance and this idea of, a single regulator or a dual regulator model. So the idea is to improve accountability and performance and in the administration of these resources. Besides identify some of the challenges around the design, around capacity, and then insulation from the political system. But we've chosen, as I understand, to consolidate all the current de facto regulators into two main bodies instead of one. What informed that choice? If you could help us just sort of understand the rationale for that. And then what are the implications, in addition to some of the points that Bitte has already raised?
Right, thanks. I think Peter has said a lot of good things about it and a lot of poor things about it. I know that there was a lot of debate around single regulatory framework or dual regulator. I know a lot of discussions were held around it and a lot of studies. But I think the key issues were the following. First of all, we had a sample of about 80 countries, and they realized about 65 had a dual regulatory system, from USA to other agencies and so. And that's one of the things that influenced the choice of a dual regulatory system. The other fear was on regulatory creep. They were afraid of regulatory creep. Having a super regulator meant that the regulator could be so powerful and would become challenging to manage and others. Then the third factor was the gas and midstream, which doesn't exist in Nigeria at the moment. I mean, there's not a gas regulator. In the last years, we've been exploring, I mean, we have more gas than crude. I mean, everybody on the panel knows this. But then there was nothing in place for midstream development. So we're careful to find an authority that would facilitate midstream development and ensure gas was developed. So this for me was the thinking behind some of the issues. Super creep, examples around the world. And then one of the we've never had a downstream regulator. We've had a price regulatory agent. Can you hear me?
We're having some technical difficulties on your end. Maybe if you could move closer to the mic.
Can you hear me now? Is it better now?
That's a little bit better, yeah. Just and then stability.
It's my internet. It's
okay.
unstable.
Okay.
So what I said was we made some good points about capacity, and capacity is an issue. Like I said, we've never had a gas regulator, nor have we ever had any regulator for the downstream. So part of the fears was having one super regulator would not make efficient growth of the midstream and downstream. And so the thinking was, if you had this authority, then you could facilitate growth in the midstream and downstream. So that's the kind of thinking the government had. And I was speaking from what government has shared with us on that perspective. Now, in terms of what it does, yes, there'll be challenges. And I'm very, I'm aware that there are issues around transitioning for agencies that are merged together. There are cultural issues, there's capacity issues and efficiency issues. But the good thing about it is that in the first 1 or 2 years, there'll be some chaos. And I think what we realize with the law is the law can be amended in steps. They can be changed in steps. And I think the key to making it happen is to ensure that those supporting implementation of the PIA are aware of these challenges and focus on it and deal with it as it happens. I mean, right now you can imagine uncertainty if you're working PPRA or PREF and what you think will happen to your job and other things. So there are issues there. So government has to bring out a national plan that is clear for these entities merging. Let us know how it will happen, what will happen with displacement, and what will happen with the gaps that will be. There will be gaps. You can't source everybody from internal processes. There are some capacities you can't find in either NNPC or somewhere else, which you have to buy from somewhere. So for me, I think that's the thinking around it. And I think, again, we should watch it as it evolves and do our part to ensure that when we think we can look at areas where nobody's thinking about it, highlight it and say, spot it on, and put it on the spot and let people think about it.
Great, thank you for that background. And hopefully some of these challenges get resolved in a timely fashion, as we've mentioned, as we've discussed. I'll move on to Wale and discuss the fiscals now. Yeah, we're here today against the backdrop of climate change and accelerating energy transition, decreasing appetite for funding fossil fuel projects. Now, given limited local financing capacity, has our window of opportunity closed? What are some of the noteworthy positive, fiscal changes in the PIA that may help reverse that decline in investments that we've experienced over the last decade? How competitive are these new fiscal terms compared to other oil and gas jurisdictions? Then the other question is, we know what the headline tax rates are and they look good, but how should provisions that may lead, additional provisions in the bill that may lead to higher effective tax rates be addressed? An example is that cost price ratio of 65%. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olu. I know where the sentiment is coming from, why some people feel that maybe Nigeria has lost the opportunity. When you started, you referenced the $50 billion that the president said Nigeria had lost in the past 10 years. Due to stagnation and non-passage of the PIB. But for me, I think it's better late than never. And the reason is simple, right? We know that demand for fossil fuel is increasing. I mean, I remember just about a couple of months ago, the IEA said everybody should stop, financing fossil. But we've seen the shortage of gas in Europe and China. There's been shutdown of factories in China. Europe is experiencing high gas prices. So what I see is that fossil fuel will continue even beyond 2050, where people have defined it at net zero emission, will continue, to be in the mix of energy sources. So our window of opportunity has not closed. But the question, of course, is how do we then harness, our resources to be able to industrialize our economy and also prepare for the transition? Because truly, the transition is here to stay, and so we've got, to be prepared for that. So that is what we need, to be worried about. And then in terms of the fiscal provisions, I think it's very important for us to first look at the objectives of the fiscal provisions in the PIA. One of the objectives is that we'll try to create a framework, that will strike a balance between the ability of the operators, to earn decent return, and of course, also the ability of government to earn revenue. So that is the two objectives we're trying to balance. And that is taken into consideration in the design of the fiscal policy. And I know that people may complain, then does it make our fiscal provisions competitive in the light of the fact that we have a dual tax regime, we have a carbon tax, and we have companies' income tax? But the fact of the matter is that when you look at the rates of both, right, they're very comparable to any other jurisdiction, right? So, I mean, currently in Nigeria, you probably will be paying about, when just looking at the headline rates itself, you'll be paying between 50% and 80%, 50% for deep offshore and 85%, for onshore and shallow waters. And what the PIA has done is that it has reduced those rates, significantly. So you'll be looking at between 40 to 60%, 45 to 60%, and of course, 30% for deep offshore. So the rates have gone down. The other thing that the PIA has done also is that they've taken a look at the royalty rates, right? And have also reduced the royalty rate significantly. I mean, currently under the Petroleum Act, you'll be looking at 20% as a royalty rate for onshore. What the PIA has done is to reduce that, to 15%. And the same thing for deep offshore, from the range of about 8 to 12%, they've reduced it to 7.5%. So there's been a reduction in royalty rates. And of course, also, is the fact that the trigger rate for the royalty by price has also come down, right? I mean, has also gone up significantly. We used to have $20 in the Petroleum Act, regulations amended, but now they've gone down, they've increased that to $50. So the petroleum price does not, the windfall tax doesn't trigger until the price, is about $50, of course. I mean, we're in a situation where oil price is now about $80. So most companies, will continue, all companies will continue to pay, the royalty, by price. So, I mean, there are things that government has done, to make the fiscal provisions, very, interesting and attractive, to investors. And of course, there's also the issue of consolidation. For deep offshore operators, currently, you will need to, to ring fence your operations from various fields. But now you can actually consolidate on the basis of, whether you have a petroleum prospecting licenses or petroleum mining leases. So those changes are there. So they're extremely competitive. But of course, you have to go beyond the rates, to talk about competitiveness. You also have to look at the rate of deductions, what kind of expenses, can you actually, deduct in determining your tax liability. And that raises the issue of the cost price ratio that everyone is talking about, the 65%. I think it's very important for us to understand why we need to have that cap. It used to be able to address, cost. We need to be able to optimize our cost. Nigeria is one country where the cost of quotation by barrel is extremely very high, right? Thank God the price is $80. You can imagine when the price is $40, we're not making decent return. So the whole essence of the cost price ratio is to control price and to control price by operators. And what the government has done to be able to ensure that at least people can recover the cost is that the big ticket items have actually been excluded, from the cost price ratio. You don't have to bother about your royalties. You don't have to bother about your rentals that you pay on your leases or the licenses. You don't have to bother about the contributions that you make to those statutory boards, whether you're talking about the Environmental Remediation Fund, host committee, those are not part of it. And interestingly, Nigeria has always had a cost cap. Even when you start from the MOU, we used to have a cost cap of $4 per barrel, right? If you increase your cost, you'll be penalized for that. Even in the current fiscal regime, there's always a cost cap. I mean, you pay tax based on 15% because your cost cap is reduced to 85%. So when we understand better the objective, that is to be able to, control costs, then we can do that. Of course, the question then is, should it be 65%? Should it be lower or should it be higher? What I suspect is that by the time we implement the PIA for a year or 2 years, we'll be able to get a better understanding. And of course, we can then use the instrument of the Finance Act, to make the changes that needs to be made. The other thing I will quickly talk about is the issue of the intangible dwelling costs, especially with respect to development, right, which is not captured in the PIA. And those costs are extremely significantly, very high. Now, currently, what the PIA says is that you have to capitalize. But what it does is to create a timing difference. But I'm sure that operators will prefer a situation where they can claim the deduction on an annual basis. So my summary is that the fiscal provisions are very competitive. But again, we'll have to look at that within 1 or 2 years to see how we compare whether we're achieving our objective.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you. So, I mean, it's good to hear that, we spent some time thinking about how, how to achieve that objective of attractiveness and competitiveness. And there are ways to close those gaps that we may have identified. I'll move on. We're not doing so well on time. I'll move on quickly to the next round of questions, just so that we can try and make up for some of the lost time. Henry, I think the next one, let me see, I'll come back to you. I think the key thing here is around gas and this decade of gas and, what are the provisions in the PIB that we have that will help us do achieve this objective of utilizing gas as a development tool. We've talked about the fact that there was a strong focus on the midstream in this bill, because that's definitely a key missing link in our gas value chain here. So Yemisi, I wanted to ask you about the establishment of this catalytic midstream fund to develop gas infrastructure. So the government will raise funding by putting levies on consumption of petrol to create this fund and use it for catalytic investment. So hopefully they do it, and then there are other people, they attract additional, crowd in additional investment. Is it, it's required, we need this infrastructure fund to realize some of our potential, to realize this massive gas potential, particularly in areas of LPG, CNG. So what are the critical success factors of managing this fund? Will open access, for example, help or impede this development?
Thanks a lot, Olu. So in principle, as framed, right, in terms of the objectives, it's a much needed construct, right? But before we go into the granular details of, how you'd implement and the critical success factor, I think one mistake again, borrowing Mr. Adiniji's phrase of insulation. How can you have such a grand idea? And when it comes to staffing the governing council that is saddled with the responsibility of making decisions, right, on the investment. When you look at the criteria, it's again like it's a political appointment. Why would you do that? Yes, there's a provision in there that says you would have independent members, but these are members that would be appointed by the president, who can stay on for 4 + 4 years. So if the decision is wrong on day one, they could end up being there for 8 years, right? So the beauty of that concept or construct, I think, fails when you look at how the governing council will be constituted. But if we look away from that for a minute and we look at what it seeks to achieve, yes, we know that there's a huge deficit, a huge gap in the midstream space and downstream when it comes to infrastructure. We cannot be talking about gas being a transition fuel or a decade of gas without infrastructure development. And because of the nature of, infrastructure and that space in it, I mean, really looking at it generally, you don't expect every supplier to own a pipeline. It's not going to work. And that's why we have it. We have that deficit, right? If every party or every supplier or every end user has to be responsible for the transmission or the transportation or distribution, then it's not going to work. So that fund helps create that. We now know that, okay, as you said, consumption tax, you have to pay something, 0.5%. Now, which bank will actually, be the custodian of those funds? That's one question. So in principle, it's good, right? But who is that bank? Which bank is this bank? Nigerian bank? Offshore bank? How do you ring-fence those funds? Because it's going to be a lot of money, right? Over time, cumulatively. And there are penalties for actually not funding, complying with the funding obligation. So where will the monies reside? Here in the country, are we going to spread the risk of insolvency, right, or mismanagement? Are we going to spread this account in different institutions? It's not very clear how that will pan out, but we're hopeful that there would be regulations prescribed. But that takes me back to the governing council. And that is not to say that, appointments because of geopolitical affiliations or appointment by the leadership would not work. It's just that we're in Nigeria and we know the way these things usually pan out. So that makes everything a bit, the full victory, the full celebration, we're not able to celebrate it like that. You have what they call the transaction advisor, who is supposed to be selected through a competitive bid process, right? And it's on a need basis. What that means is you may not have a transaction advisor because it's on a need basis. So if the governing council thinks that there is no need, you may not have a transaction advisor. Even if it is competitive, it depends on who you have within that competition and the pool. So will it be a political appointment? Because these are key gates. If the selection process and the criteria for identifying infrastructure and the funding compatibility, the time for project development, if it's sound, right, then the fund will yield its result. If it is not sound, we are in trouble. So key success, management, setting up of that fund, ring fencing the funds, installation, very important. Is there going to be a political selection in terms of determining whether it goes to the first tier bank or it goes to the third tier bank because of relationship and we don't know.
Yeah.
So there are a number of indices that need to be worked in, but is it a beautiful plan? Yes, it is. Now going to open access. Open access, again, can we actually succeed without open access? Open access ensures non-discriminatory access. You don't have to favor me because I'm Dangote. If I can play by the rules, right, I can plug and play. We need it in the system. The people that should be concerned are the own carriers who now don't have a choice and would have third-party access imposed on them. But if you're set up as a common carrier, you're not a bullet pipeline system for designated project. Why not if not? Because I know people are really shouting against and shooting against open access, but we cannot thrive if we don't have open access infrastructure on the common carriers.
Thank you very much, Yemisi. Bita, I'll come to you on this realization of our ambitions for gas as our transition fuel in the decade of gas. It requires a reorientation from maximizing government take to utilizing gas as a development tool. I think a few people have alluded to that already. And that development tool is just not within this energy value chain or gas value chain, but to catalyze other capabilities and other value chains in the country, so that we're not in 10 years talking about how 90% of our revenue comes from 90% of our foreign exchange comes from this sector. So my question to you, and given your long history with regulations in this regard, is have we finally achieved the right balance between regulations, because there's still delivery obligations in there, there's still a gas pricing framework, and then the incentives, some of the things that Wale mentioned, lower royalties, and taxes to attract this much needed capital for the domestic market. The other side of the coin, of course, is bankable offtake. So anything you can share on that around how we solve that other side of the problem would be great. But I just want to remind everybody that we need to manage our time accordingly.
Well, that was not a 3-minute question, definitely.
I know, but do your best.
And it's because it's gas. It's very important that
yes,
I explain this as delicately as possible to the audience, right? Because many people don't understand gas. So it's very important to understand. Now, the first thing is this: it's very, very good that we finally have legislation that addresses gas. Gives a lot of clarity. So that's a big tick, right, for the government for actually coming to this point. Anyone now wanting to get involved in the gas sector sees very clearly the basis on which they get a license. They will understand the conditions that apply to the license and all that. That's excellent. The clear licensing framework in place. We also see, when you read the bill, the policy of the act. The policy of the act is basically to see how we can use these gas resources for two big objectives: domestic utilization for industrialization. That's very clear in that bill. And again, that's another big take. And also for the export revenues, right? So you see how the bill seeks to prioritize low-cost gas resources for domestic use. I think that's excellent, right? You also see how in the tiering of the different gas supply sources, they very delicately exclude deep offshore gas, right, from domestic supply, because the understanding is clear. Offshore gas in deep water is actually expensive to produce. So they say, well, that should go for export. That's the implication there. Okay, so there's some very good things in there. Then you create a distinct midstream, which allows anyone to come in, right, and decide to invest if they want to, whether in gas processing or in gas transportation, as opposed to just staying in the upstream. And the upstream can keep its money where it best uses the money for finding gas and producing gas while somebody transports it. So there are very important things in there. There's a domestic gas delivery obligation, which now goes to your question, right? Which is designed to ensure gas supply to what they've identified as the strategic sectors, which is power, gas-based industries such as urea, fertilizer, methanol, all those sort of things, which is very good for the industrialization vision, and then also for the commercial sector. And that's excellent. But unfortunately, in the same bill, the government now drops the ball. It drops the ball with the provisions relating to pricing. Because by hardwiring the issue of gas aggregation in the bill, you basically have created some incongruence. And let me explain how that works. Gas aggregation is basically you're blending the receipts, payment receipts from all the different off-takers of gas. You put them in a pot and you create one single price out of it. Now that's dangerous. That's unbankable, really. That's your bankability question. It's unbankable. Lenders will be very unhappy about it because lenders want to know what's the price you're going to get for your gas. Oh, you say nominally, it's what the government says in the bill. But in reality, I don't know what I'll get. Well, the bank can say, please come back next time when you know. So that's a big problem. And it's got to be addressed. Again, we go back to the first thing we discussed when we started this panel, which is basically that 10-year vision. You cannot put things in the bill that gets in the way of that vision. The domestic gas delivery obligation is fantastic. Aggregation, price aggregation doesn't work. You can say gas aggregation, that works, because you need someone to be able to calibrate the supply between match buyers to sellers. That's fine. But the pricing area is where the problem is, and it's a big issue. So they say there'll be transitional pricing, fantastic, but when does it end? They don't say. They don't say too clearly. They say, but they don't say too clearly. They say, well, when all the demand in the country is met with supply. Why does that happen? Because you forget that the largest off-taker for gas in the country is the power sector, which currently is in a mess. It will always have demand for gas, but to the extent that it's unbankable, that transition will never end until you're able to resolve that problem. And how is it going to be resolved? We don't see too clearly. So when you look at the chain, right, the chain doesn't look good. The energy chain, and I'm not talking about the gas chain now, the entire energy chain, going all the way from production all the way down, right, to power. It's not a good chain. There are two regulators in between, and then there are very significant issues in the pricing issues, payment discipline issues, and all that, which will affect that vision. But it will work. It could potentially work, right, for the industrial sector, potentially. We have to see how the regulators are going to be able to help that process move forward. So it works also for pipelines because of a 10-year tax holiday. That's fantastic. Yeah, that's fantastic. But unfortunately, the PIB now misses the opportunity of extending that tax holiday to the other delivery systems that could get gas into underserved markets very quickly. These are the CNGs and the mini LNGs and the LPGs and all that. Because what we're looking for is very fast penetration that will help the domestic gas sector get off the ground very quickly. Okay, you have a 5-year tax holiday, but if you could give 10 to pipelines, why can't you give to virtual pipelines? That's the question. There's so many issues in gas. We could talk for an hour, but let's leave it at that for now. Luke, over to you.
No, thank you. Yes, MBC needs to have, more, separate deep dive sessions, especially on this decade of gas. 35 minutes will not do it justice at all. But thanks for just giving us an overview of where those challenges are. I.e., we have some in some ways, some regulations are necessary. And some of the incentives are there, but then, there are missed opportunities. One would hope that we have learned from all the different permutations of regulations in the sector and not sufficient incentives to sort of, stimulate this domestic market. I'll go to Henry on the next question, another key area of the bill or the act. I should correct myself. I'm so used to calling it the bill, but it's an act now. Henry, there's the establishment of the Petroleum Host Community Fund that could bring about much needed development in our host communities, foster a more secure operating environment, reduce some of those costs, because some of the, we're talking about, tax deductibility, limitations around tax deductibility, but the truth is we're incurring those costs. Yeah, so how do we, if we can lower those costs with, by addressing some of the insecurity issues in that part of our country through this host community fund, that would be great. Is it an improvement on the status quo? Because we've done this a few times in different permutations with MOUs. We have NDDC. Accountability and judiciousness are the critical success factors here. How does the PIA address these? And how will we measure success going forward?
Thank you for that. Just a quick thing before I move on to that question you asked. One of the things about the gas streaming, I'm sorry to take us back, about the midstream fund is it's insufficient. We did the model, and annually it rises about $5 billion, which is very insufficient. The needs every year is about $300 to $325 billion for the sufficiency of the sector. So the fund right now is insufficient, and so much to think about that and calculate how that can be improved upon. Back to your question about the host community and the issues there. You are very correct. It's been tried so many times. And what I see right now is a modified GMOU, which is now adopted into a law and things. But there's some good things that have happened. The first good thing is, before the law, we had no host community designation. It wasn't a legal thing. A lot of people don't realize that. People miss that. Before the PIA, there wasn't anything called host community in law, in real terms. There was it in practice, there was it in attribution. But in legal terms, there was nothing there. So right now, there's a step forward. You can define what host community is. It's clear now in the Act what host community is. Now, the issue about stability. As of today now, we did 1.376 million barrels per day. We've got an allocation of 1.65 and for something. We've never met our allocations in the last 12 years because, again, there's oil theft and there's vandalism. Oil theft is very, very high now. Oil theft is about 250,000 barrels a day. Might estimate it's getting higher and higher. But some things have worked. Most companies are able to make things work for themselves in a way that wasn't codified in the law. Some more companies have ensured community participation in profit and losses, and in that way have secured their pipelines and secured production. It's a good thing. Now, I think what the PIA is trying to do with those community trust funds is to ensure this becomes a standard that can be adopted and used by our communities. Now, will it work for everybody? Will it make some marginal increases? Yes, it will. The issues around implementation, which needs a lot more clarity. The issues around domiciliation, a lot more clarity. Now, we've tried it with HiPrep. HiPrep is ongoing. HiPrep is working on the same model in a very small manner. And if this is expanded properly and implemented properly, then it can have some changes. Now, what they've done, try to do is tie losses and things safe, then you get more. You don't make it happen, you get less. Where is always a challenge is with the double details. Could that have been better designed? I think so. Could that have been done under a more structured form? I think so as well. Will it bring changes? It can. It always depends on what's happening. But again, like I say to everybody, there must be all flowing first. Good all flowing for there to be an industry. Every other thing rests on that ability to get this thing going. Whether we have the good fiscals, whether we have good administration, whether we have good governance. If there is no crude oil flowing or gas exploration, then there is no oil industry. And where at least to some extent we can secure assets, secure issues. Even with the pipeline and the network codes and the pipeline distribution that you can invest in and get the material, you have to have peace in those communities for it to happen. So it's a game. Now, I've seen a lot of people angry with it and saying, oh, it's not 5%, it's 3%. Well, I think 0 plus 1 is 1. 0 plus 0 is 0. I mean, nothing else has been taken away from what is existing. Something else has been added to it. Could there have been more? Yes, it could have been more. Could there have been anything? Yes, but it is, again, it's a positive thing. It's in the right direction. The devil will be now implemented, how it's tested. I think there will be success in some areas. I think there will be failures in some areas. That's my point on that.
Thank you very much. I like your point about, whether or not the way you wrapped it up there, 3% of a really big pie is significant, and we use it judiciously in those communities. Lives will be changed and improved for the better, and we'll have security there, and the pie keeps growing. So thanks for that. We have one more question, and it's the last one for the panelists before we open it up to the audience. They've been waiting patiently, so Mr. Adewale, we'll need to jump quickly through this one. Henry touched on something there around, reserves and growing our reserves. Society is not rich, right? Because it's endowed with a lot of resources. It is rich because of what it does with those endowments. What is the policy objective of the acreage management process in the PIA? Is it to grow reserves or to grow production? Especially with regards to gas, which we've defined as our next area of focus going forward. You will know that Nigeria has a relatively high reserves to production ratio. It's 110 years versus Saudis, that's 54 years, and they have the sort of roughly same resource base. So should we be funding things like a frontier exploration fund when we haven't actually developed what we have? With our limited resources, instead of catalyzing investments in all these other areas that we have identified as good investments?
Okay, thank you so much. I think in my view, the key objective really is to grow our reserves, right? And ultimately, of course, you grow your production. When you look at our reserve history, what you find out is that over the past 20 years, we've stayed around 37 billion barrels, right? And our ambition is to get up to 40 billion barrels, and we're still struggling, right? So when you grow your reserves, you grow your production. The problem we have is that with the Petroleum Act, the requirements are extremely lax, and that is why we're stuck at the 37 billion barrels, of oil. So the main issue really is to grow reserves. And like I said, it should lead to increase in production. But when you then look at Nigeria, it's possible for you to grow reserves without actually growing your production for so many reasons. And I think some of my members of the panelists touch on this. One, of course, is the production quota. We've been struggling to meet our production quota, currently about 1.63 million barrels of oil per day. And it doesn't even include condensate. And we're doing on the average about 1.3. If you back out 300,000 barrels of condensate a day. So we're struggling to meet our production target. And of course, you also have the issue of oil theft, right? And then of course, you also have pipeline attacks. And when you have pipeline attacks, what that does, of course, is that people have to shut in production. And when you shut production, it becomes difficult for you to restart, wells that have been shut in. So that's a big issue. So we need to be able to deal with that. But what I'm really happy about when you look at the PIA is that it focuses on those areas. How do we ensure that we have an effective acreage management? So it talks about terms like drill or drop. You can have an acreage and you may decide to hold on to it for a very long time without doing anything about it, even without meeting the obligations of the work plan. But under the current PIA, if you don't drill and you don't do appraisal, you have to drop. And that is fantastic. And the second thing, of course, is that when you look at Nigeria, we have so many undeveloped acreages. People just sit on acreages, right? And but now you can't do that again. And the other thing they've done also is to reduce the size of those concessions. You just look at the share size. Under the Petroleum Act, you have a oil prospecting license of the size close to about 2,050 square kilometers. And what the PIA has done is to reduce that significantly to about 350 square kilometers for onshore and shallow water, and then 1,000 for deep offshore, and 1,500 for frontier areas. Just trying to manage that. And of course, we have the conversion process whereby if you decide to do a voluntary conversion, you need to relinquish some of those assets so that other companies can take it, and develop, the fields. And of course, there's a provision for significant gas, discovery, where you can actually retain it for about 10 years. So the key objective really is to grow reserves. Now, when you talk about the frontier exploration, I know there are sentiments about this. And of course, the question is, how do you strike that delicate balance between optimizing our current production and then spending money on wild catch areas where you don't even know whether there is going to be oil, or even if there is deposit of oil? The issue would be, can you commercially recover, those deposits? And that's the big question. We spend so much money, exporting for oil in Yola Basin, and we didn't find oil. Now, we're looking at the 6 frontier areas. So that is the balance we need to strike. So I can understand the sentiment that do we have to spend that money? And of course, if you look at the PIA critically, what they've done is that they recognize the fact that commercial entities may not really be interested, in testing for data in the frontier areas. And that is why they've given that responsibility to NNPC Limited. So it's only the national oil company that can do that. And so that is one area that we need to be careful about. But, with respect to gas, I think the key objective with gas is that we want to be able to enhance our gas for domestic market. And that also takes into consideration the issue really of energy transition, right? If the international market doesn't need our gas, we can use it to develop, our economy in Nigeria. And that is why the midstream sector is extremely critical, to the success of the PIA. The way we implement the provisions of the midstream sector will go a long way towards achieving our objective. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's an interesting perspective. So the focus there is to grow reserves, oil reserves, because we have more than enough gas what we need to do is focus on production of that gas and monetizing it within our domestic market. It's interesting that we want to, that we have decided that the national oil company, so back to Yemisi's earlier point around, in theory, an NNPC Limited is good, but the market has already provided for exploration. It's profitable for markets to do so. So a key question is this a judicious use? Are we crowding out private capital? If there's no private capital in its space that they use typically private capital, it means it's probably not the right thing to do. It's not profitable. So why do we have an NPC doing that? Let's move on to the audience. We have a few questions. Thank you to our panelists. They've done, justice in the limited time that they have to this wide array of topics. We have a question from Nojim Jimo. He says, officially, there's no subsidy for PMS, but subsidies continues to be paid. How do we reconcile this with the PIA going forward? Who wants to take that question? a subsidy question.
Let me take the question because it's something we've worked on for a period of time. It's a very difficult thing to legislate upon. It's a very difficult thing to do. So the PIA is not very clear on what will happen. It proposes that as soon as the act was signed, subsidy would go because it makes NNPC commercial, and NNPC shouldn't be using the cost of crude sales to defray cost of importation of petrol. But again, it's not a law is not a law in our tradition. There's an abstract economy around it. At the moment, we have an inflation trend that is coming down. We moved down to 7.45, I think, in the last announcement. And any increase in petroleum prices now, especially $3, would mean a barrel of a liter of petrol would sell at 301 naira. I don't know if the economy can absorb that. I don't know if we can live with that with other indices of poverty and other things out there. So I think there's an economic argument, but also a political argument. And the economic argument makes sense to say, well, this is a big area of waste, this is a very big area of loss, and this is a big area of less remittance to state governments and the federation accounts. But then there's also the economic argument of thinking we want to drive towards inflationary pressure reduction. There's a lot of pressure on the currency as it is, and taking out subsidy immediately would sort of kill the economy in a way. So I think people are, the government is being cautious of what they do and how they do it. I think what the law might have prescribed is like a transition process for 6 months. The law says for 6 months, NNPC will guarantee imports. After 6 months, then things will change. So I think we're still in that process of transition. Hopefully, oil prices come down lower. The ideal price for Nigeria in terms of a barrel price is $60. $80, it doesn't look good to us and many other indices. So hopefully, then we get back to $60 a barrel, and then the condition made on that. Back to you.
Thank you for that, Henry. I'm just going to try to look through our Q&A box, which I seem to have lost. Okay, here. Sorry about that. There was a question. I think the next question is around, leadership of NNPC Limited and whether or not this is a case of new wine in old skin. I think Yemisi already addressed that. This came earlier in the conversation. Yemisi already sufficiently addressed that question. And because of it, how much is going to change? That depends on implementation, is sort of where we've discussed this. There are no considerations for net zero or sustainability. How do we take that? This is a question from Ayobola Anialo. Are there any considerations for net zero and sustainability beyond what Yemisi has identified, which is, that NNPC is supposed to invest in renewables? Vita, are you taking that question?
So I was just going to say, net zero is not all about renewables.
Correct.
The transition fuel, as we mentioned earlier on, is gas.
Mm-hmm.
The PIA robustly has provisions addressing gas, and that's the first time in the history of the country that's been done. Yes, I've identified some problems around those provisions, but generally, many of the provisions actually are good, save for the ones that need to be adjusted. But then also, you must also note the provisions also against gas flaring. Our largest carbon point sources in the country for emissions are basically our oil and gas fields, where we're basically spewing flaring gas in about 167 flare sites. The provisions in the PIA basically address gas flaring, saying there'll be no new gas flaring allowed in any new oil production. And then also, it also incorporates the provisions of the gas flare prevention of waste and pollution regulations, which is probably the most current rules around gas flaring. So it's now basically just up to the regulator to implement those regulations. And if they do so faithfully, you will have probably one of the largest climate action programs globally implemented in Nigeria. Nigeria just has to have the political will and the ministerial supervision this time to ensure that those regulations are implemented. Because if they are, you could actually turn what is waste into wealth in many Niger Delta communities. That's basically the power of those regulations. It's just basically up to the minister to do his work and get those regulations implemented fast. Then we'll then have a proper transition response.
Thank you for that. I think, that sufficiently addresses that. Net zero doesn't mean no oil and gas. And that even though we don't contribute much to emissions globally, our main source is within our production, and there are potential solutions within the bill to address that main source of emissions. The next question is from James Morris. Companies which supply gas to the domestic market are paid in Naira, yet there's no provision to allow gas royalties to be paid in Naira. It is very difficult in practice to convert Naira to USD. Why has this not been addressed? Wally, I'll give you that question.
Okay, can you repeat that question again, sir?
The question is, domestic companies are going to be paid in Naira. Guys who are supplying to the domestic market are going to be paid in Naira. Their receivables are going to be in Naira, but their royalties, there's no provision that they're allowed to pay their royalties in Naira, and convertibility between Naira and USD is a tough one, as we know, in this market. So why has this not been addressed?
Oh, okay. There's actually a provision in the law that allows companies to pay the royalty in Naira at the exchange rate. So the PIA is also very clear on that, because the whole idea really is also to develop, the use of gas. So, and even oil, for royalty for oil, you can actually pay in Naira. So there's a provision for that. So that issue has already been addressed.
Great, thank you. The other question is from another attendee who says, Yemisi mentioned the loopholes associated with governance stipulated by the Act. These issues are already there, like she mentioned, no new culture. What can be done? No new culture or tools to implement infrastructure plan. What can be done with regards to this issue? So Yemisi, that's a question for you.
What can be done? Because I'd mentioned earlier that we need people, competent people, because the plans are good, right? But competent people. Can we force the government to appoint or nominate competent people? No, we cannot. Can we be hopeful? Can we lobby? Can we be, out there frontal about it, speaking to these issues? I guess this is I think this is the first webinar of that speaks to this issue. It's not necessarily focused on, okay? So maybe it's time to identify the areas that need to be looked into beyond governance, NNPC Limited, beyond host communities, right? All those fine points, and begin to have, pressure groups or, groups that are speaking about it, so that even if we end up with the political appointers, those three independent members, one can ensure, well, hopefully, that, appointments, they're looking for people that can actually do the job. That transaction advisor, in appointing that guy, when selecting or identifying the banks or the institutions that would be custodian of the fund, who is speaking to government, who is advising. So it all depends on us. We're all Nigerians, right? It's because when the decision has to be made, if it will favor me, I then forget all these lofty ideas, right? Is that what will happen? Or will I hold on to this point I'm speaking to? So it's not a yes or no answer, and there is no strategic answer. It's just that we need competent people. And, when we look at what's being done currently, new wine in old skin, old wine in new skin, new wine skin, we can only be hopeful. You wake up today, there's an authority that has been staffed. You wake up tomorrow, the members have changed. What is influencing what? When the first decision was made, was it not thought through? It doesn't give confidence. But the question is, what can be done? We pray. That's what we say in Nigeria.
Now we resort to that, even though, clearly prayers is what's kept us alive.
Can I add something quickly? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure. Yes, thank you.
There are two things that could emerge. There could be orderly transition and there could be chaos. Order transition has benefits, chaos has benefits. Right now we have a chaos situation. Chaos has some good things that can happen with it. When you're transitioning, three things can change your perspectives. What you've planned, what happens at point of interventions, and what you see as coming out from your processes. So I think the chaos process is good for us as it is now. I would have shuddered if a lot of things were written into law. Then we couldn't have changed things properly. I think what we can do is support the transition process with information and knowledge as far as we can. I mean, around this panelists, there are a lot of competent lawyers and competent people. I mean, Peter is there and other people. I think bringing those ideas together and in a way, influencing the thinking around it is good. Because again, I understand that some people don't have new ideas to go to because there's no new idea somewhere there. And so if we sit here and bellyache about, oh, this is going to happen, well, let's bring some new ideas in. So I think there's an opportunity on this chaos process. That's what I want to add to it.
Thank you for that. Let me add, I'm going to combine two questions because I think they're related. Benga Adesonwo and Oyinye. It's a question around this, closing window of financing for infrastructure for fossil fuel projects. The question is, how do we manage the emerging funding issues arising from this activist investors to ensure that we're able to deliver on some of the objectives that we've identified today? Then, Oyinye asked the question, which is kind of similar to what we're getting at before, which is, why are we growing reserves and increasing production when there's declining demand for oil? And of course, the world is shifting away and investing in green energy. What will happen to our reserves if we are compelled to shift to clean energy? Anyone who feels, they're best placed to take that of the panelists, please go ahead.
Let me take that, Chodu. Let me start from the second part of that question that talked about, why are we growing reserves in the midst of clean energy transition? I think the first way to look at it is to look at what is happening in UK and China today, right? What has happened is that gas prices have gone up. There's gas shortage in China. And the reason is simply because of the green energy transition, policy of these countries, right? Even the IEA is calling on OPEC, to increase production. Right. So what I think is that oil and gas will still remain beyond 2050. And I think that is the problem that a lot of people have forgotten. Now, China is scrambling for coal. All the coal plants that have been shut down, they're trying to open them because they use the gas. Winter is approaching and they need the gas to power electricity. The same thing in the UK. So as far as I'm concerned, the transition is going to be gradual. It's not going to be rapid, right? And so what do we have to grow reserves? We have the oil. The oil in the ground is not good for us. We need to monetize it, and we can use it to industrialize this economy. And that is the whole essence. Even if there is a reduction in demand, which interestingly, about 2, 3, 5 months ago, the forecast demand is that the demand will wane in 10 years. But that has been reversed to 2050 because actually there is appetite for fossil fuel. So we need to grow to be prepared for that demand and also to industrialize the economy. Then speaking to the funding issue, yes, I'm aware that some banks, RMB, for example, they've said, oh, yes, we're not going to finance fossil fuel projects. And we've seen investors that are taking over the board of some companies, right? Because everybody is talking about, greening in all the projects, green energy, we need to transition. But at the end of the day is that there will always be banks, institutions that will want to be able to finance projects, fossil fuel projects that are bankable. And when you look at Africa today, and you can see that across Africa and even beyond Africa, you've seen big projects coming out of Senegal, you've seen big projects coming out of Guyana and Suriname, right? And so there will always be institutions that will still want to finance even in the midst of transition to clean energy, because demand is actually increasing. It's not declining.
Thank you very much for that response. Our audience, unfortunately, we don't have enough time there's so many questions in that box that I want to get to, but we've run out of time. So what I will do is take those, try to address those questions offline, because there's so many really good questions there that we want to make sure that our panelists have an opportunity to address, and we'll try to do the best to share that offline with you. So I'm just gonna wrap up very quickly. I think what we've heard today is that we are aware, that the energy transition is accelerating and will impact financing, but the extent to which that will occur depends on really what the maturity of the alternatives. That's one. That's sort of to points that Wale has made, right? There's a reason that the US still uses quite a bit of coal to generate electricity. So then the second point I think that has been raised here, which is why gas has been identified as a transition fuel, is that there's no such thing as a perfect suit. It's just a perfectly tailored suit for a person, yeah? So for our own particular situation, there is no template or blueprint, like MEC alluded to earlier. Every country needs to sort of determine how to reduce its own carbon emissions. BT has identified, we know where we are, we know our source of highest emissions, and we're trying to work on those solutions. But maybe what's more relevant in our environment is around more climate adaptation versus mitigation, given that we don't contribute much to it. We're advocating for an equitable and an equitable transition, but we need to be accountable for the things that are within our control. That's our investment climate and our operating environment and how well we implement this bill. There have been so many gaps that our panelists have pointed to. We didn't even have enough time to get into them, that we need to sort of work through within this closing window. It has been 65 years since commercial discovery at Oloibiri. Our need to fuel economic growth at rates that significantly exceed our population growth has never been more urgent. My hope is that when we celebrate the 10th anniversary of PIA, at the end of our decade of gas, that we have successfully attracted the capital and capabilities that we need for this sector to catalyze diversification of our economy, as well as the sources of foreign exchange and government income. That our policies have facilitated the creation of high-paying jobs across multiple sectors and lifted over 100 million Nigerians that currently live in poverty out of poverty. I would like to thank our esteemed panelists for taking time out of their very busy schedules to share their experience and their ideas. I'd like to thank our audience for participating and contributing to this rich conversation. And finally, I'd like to thank our hosts for providing this platform for the exchange of ideas. I'd like to invite Mrs. Adeola Aziz to give you the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
You see me? Can you hear me? Yes. Olu, thank you very much. And that was fantastic. So on behalf of the chamber, I would like to thank all our panelists, a very rich one. They had so much to unpack in such a little time. Our moderator, fantastic. Our patron, our council members, our sponsors, GMT Energy Resources and Richardson Oil and Gas. Ladies and gentlemen, the Energy Group and the NBCC headquarters for this educative, informative, and illuminating webinar. I would also like to keep you updated of our upcoming events. We have the Digital Marketing Masterclass on Wednesday 13th and Thursday 14th of October. We also have the Meet the Governor of Ondo State to explore investment and business opportunities, holding on Thursday, October 21st at 12 p.m. And to watch out for the third edition of the Africa EduTech Conference, themed Education and Technology, Bridging the Gap, scheduled to hold on Thursday, October 28th. Also, if you are interested in becoming a member of our esteemed chamber, please feel free to visit our website, www.nbcc.org.ng. And please do not hesitate to follow us on all our social media handles. and be informed of all our activities. Thank you very, very much. And I do wish all of you a very, very good day. Thank you, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.